All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're demystifying the gritty reality of how organizations actually transition from high-level strategic goals to, well, keeping real cash in the bank. We're going to look specifically at the fascinating financial mechanics behind public institutions, pulling from some really extensive training materials on financial planning, forecasting, and public finance management.
But before we get into the nuts and bolts, I want you to ask yourself a really practical question. How do public institutions, like a technical and vocational education and training college, or TVET in Kenya, actually keep their doors open and the lights on when massive government grants are suddenly delayed? Because let me tell you, it happens way more often than you might think. A master plan is great, but survival depends entirely on what happens when the math hits the real world.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, the financial planning process. Second, forecasting. Third, building the master budget. And finally, cash flow and risk.
Okay, Section 1, the financial planning process, or connecting strategy to resources.
Listen, you simply can't build a budget if you don't know your destination, right? As this quote brilliantly points out, a budget isn't just some spreadsheet filled with random numbers. It's actually the financial manifestation of an organization's long-term strategy and its commitments to stakeholders. Financial planning is this continuous ongoing process. You have to assess the business environment, lock in your objectives, and then quantify the exact resources, the labor, the equipment, the materials you'll need to actually achieve those goals. It's all about giving your grand business plan some real, rigorous financial weight.
So, to put this into practice, especially in places like the Kenyan public sector, institutions use highly structured frameworks like the MTEF. That stands for Medium-Term Expenditure Framework, and it's essentially a rolling 3-year approach. That specific time frame is absolutely key here. It ensures that strategic policy priorities actually get the multi-year fiscal space they need to become a reality. It literally forces leaders to look beyond just the next 12 months and align their long-term vision with actual allocated resources.
Moving right along to Section 2, forecasting, predicting the future and establishing the mathematical foundation.
Now that we're moving from abstract strategy to hard numbers, we have to, well, predict the future to build our master budget. You literally can't budget for expenses if you have absolutely no clue what your demand or your revenue is going to look like. Forecasters generally rely on 2 different approaches, depending on the data they have on hand. They use subjective, qualitative methods, like the Delphi method, which is basically polling a panel of experts when historical data is scarce. But they switch to quantitative methods, using heavy mathematical formulas like regression or time series when they have solid historical data to track trends, seasonal patterns, or cycles.
Take a look at how a quantitative tool like a weighted moving average actually functions. Unlike a basic simple average, this method mathematically prioritizes recent events. For example, to forecast November's demand, management heavily weighs October's performance at 50%, while way back in August only gets a 17% weight. When you do the math, they forecast 103.4 orders. It's a super smart way to adjust a forecast so it closely reflects recent market fluctuations.
All right, Section 3, building the master budget, translating those forecasts into action.
So, with our revenue and demand forecasts locked in, we consolidate the whole shebang into the master budget. Building a budget for a public institution, like a TVET, is a highly structured, rigorous cycle. It kicks off with assessing needs and estimating resources, moves rapidly into formulating the actual numbers, projecting the cash flow, reviewing everything against treasury ceilings, and finally executing the plan. Following this cycle to the letter is absolutely critical to avoid those dreaded pending bills. Unpaid obligations carried forward that cause massive reputational and audit damage down the line. During that resource estimation step we just talked about, these institutions have to forecast revenue across a few distinct streams. Government capitation, disbursed by the Ministry of Education, is absolutely the lifeblood, but managers know it's highly prone to delay. And that is exactly why appropriation in aid, or AIA, which includes things like tuition and boarding fees, provides such crucial operational flexibility. They also factor in donor grants, which are amazing for development, but often come with heavy conditions, as well as small, internal income-generating projects.
Now look at the stark reality of how expenditures actually break down in a typical scenario. Out of a total estimated spend of $68 million, a massive $48 million is just eaten up by recurrent costs. We're talking salaries, allowances, and basic utilities. This leaves managers to incredibly carefully prioritize the remaining, much smaller slices for development, like, say, an ICT lab upgrade, and basic operational costs like training materials. It's a really delicate balancing act to ensure those massive recurrent costs don't completely cannibalize long-term investment.
Which brings us to Section 4, Cash Flow and Risk, Managing the Real-World Reality.
Okay, so we have our brilliant blueprint, but a budget is really only as good as the cash actually flowing into the bank. Every single budget relies on underlying assumptions. Say an institution builds its budget assuming fee collection efficiency is going to hit 85%. But what if enrollment suddenly drops? Or what if students simply can't pay on time? Your projected AIA revenue plummets, and suddenly your entire operational framework is at serious risk. Your cash flow forecast absolutely has to account for these kinds of enrollment and collection fluctuations.
It's the exact same story with inflation. Projecting, say, a 6% inflation rate is a totally necessary assumption to figure out what utilities, supplies, and construction contracts are going to cost down the road. But if inflation spikes to 10%, that's $7 million you budgeted for a classroom renovation. It's no longer going to cover the cost of materials, and we all know how fast prices can jump. True risk management means actively planning for these exact scenarios.
And here is where we have to shift from optimistic planning to absolute, gritty pragmatism. Imagine you're the accounting officer. Your forecast shows an expected inflow of $50 million in government capitation, but the Treasury delays the disbursement by 3 whole months. If that massive cash inflow is delayed, how on earth do you pay your instructors next week? How do you physically keep the lights on?
To avoid a total liquidity crisis and the severe audit queries that come with it, managers have got to have a cash flow forecast schedule that anticipates these exact gaps and triggers emergency mitigation measures. They might need to immediately tap into internal AIA reserves, completely pause non-essential development projects like that classroom renovation, or aggressively negotiate temporary credit lines with their suppliers. It is all about liquidity management, making sure you have the actual cash on hand to meet your immediate short-term obligations.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought. A master budget is a brilliant, totally necessary blueprint that connects your long-term strategy to your daily operations. But ultimately, your organization's survival completely depends on your agility, your ability to pivot, mitigate risks, and aggressively manage your liquidity when the real-world cash flow inevitably doesn't match the pristine plan on paper. Think about your own organization's assumptions for a second. Are you actually ready for when they fail?